Hello, it's David Dayen here, the executive editor of the American Prospect, and it's my great pleasure to have with me the co-founder of the Prospect, and still chugging along as an editor and a key member of the team, Bob Kuttner. How you doing?
Good, good, good to be here.
Well, you put out a book, and I'm going to let you explain what the title of the book is and what it means. But it's a memoir, right? A memoir of your life.
Well, it's a political memoir. It's called Notes for Next Time, and the subtitle is Surviving Tyranny, Redeeming America, a personal and political memoir. Um, so let me take a moment and explain why I did this and
Hmm.
what I'm trying to achieve with it. Part of this, of course, is personal. You get to be a certain age, you do a stock taking. You wonder what it's all about, what sort of a life you've led, what sort of impact you've had, if any, if you've been any sort of a public person. Um, and there's a difference between a memoir and an autobiography. An autobiography is more purely personal. Memoir is more your involvement in events during your lifetime. When I was in my uh, late 30s, early 40s, I was working. I was working at the New Republic. I was doing a column in the Globe that was syndicated by the Post. And one day, my daughter, who was about 7 at the time, said, "Daddy, are you famous?" And I said, "Well, I'm a little bit famous." And being a little bit famous is not a reason enough to do an autobiography. Who cares? But I felt because I tried to make an impact, and one of my chapters, which I think is emblematic, is called "Winning the Arguments, Losing the Politics." I wanted to see what kind of lessons we could infer from the struggles that I was involved in, and my generation was involved in. Why did we keep being proven right on the arguments? And why did the other side keep winning on the politics? That's kind of the overarching political theme. And I guess the title Notes for Next Time is a way of saying, okay, there is going to be a next time. It's a kind of optimism that the American Republic is not finished. It's battered and bruised. But the subtext is, I think we will survive Trump, but next time is going to be really tough.
So I think people who have read The Prospect for a long time, who've read your work in not just there, but in any number of places, New York Times, New York Review of Books, they have a pretty good sense of your belief system, and your sense of history, what where you've seen America both meet its sort of ideals and where it's gone off track. So, the thing I kind of want to cover in this session is more about the personal, and then we can have that reflect
Sure.
on the politics. But let's just go through it. So you were born in New York, right?
I was.
Was where in Manhattan or in Brooklyn or
I was born in the Bronx,
in the
and I
Bronx?
think I think where I was born and the time in which I was born, uh, and I talk about this in the book, was
Yeah.
a great influence on what my values and aspirations turned out to be. So, my parents had a very tough time in the Depression. They didn't have any money. They lived in a succession of small apartments in Queens. My father was,
Were they first generation or
no, no, no. They were third or fourth generation.
oh, okay. So your family came over to America a
Well, it's
while
a
back.
complicated story. My mother's family were assimilated German Jews that
Hmm.
first came here in the 1840s.
Wow.
My father's family, a couple of generations back, were Eastern European Jews, but by the time my father came around, they were well assimilated. So in any case, I mean, my dad graduated high school in 1929. Couldn't have been a worse time.
Hmm.
And so he really struggled during the Depression. And then when the war came, he was drafted. And I'll get to
He
that
was
in a
pretty
minute.
old to be drafted, and if he graduated high school in 29, he was probably
Yeah, he
his
was
early 30s. And
almost too old to be drafted.
right.
He was in his 30s, but by then this is 1943.
Hmm.
They needed everybody, and
Right.
he had one kid at that point. That wasn't enough to keep you out. So he was drafted, and but I'm getting ahead of my story. Let me just add one
Yeah.
detail. So I was born in a moderate income housing project called Parkchester in the East Bronx, and it was built. It was actually developed by MetLife, but it was built with all kinds of public subsidies, and the idea was to have decent housing for lower middle class, working class people. And it was lovely. And my parents thought they had won the lottery when they got an apartment in Parkchester. And my dad was drafted. He was in the Normandy invasion. He was taken prisoner in the Battle of the
Wow.
Bulge. He spent several months in
So
it.
you're what, 2 years old when he
I'm
leaves?
2 years old, yeah.
Wow.
And no, I'm 2 years old when he comes back. I'm 6 months old when he leaves.
Oh, wow.
And and barely survives the war. He and a bunch of guys, when the Russians liberated the camp and kept the prisoners as bargaining counters, they stole bicycles and pedaled to the American lines.
Mm,
So, in any case, after the war, my grandmother died. My grandfather, my parents moved to suburbia so I could go to a good school, and then my father died when I was 9. And
mm,
but here's the punchline of this story. Um, So I grew up um, having been told that, Parkchester, the government helped create housing for working class people. And then when my father got sick, he was in a state-of-the-art VA hospital.
hmm.
And then when the year he was sick, my mother and I started having very adult conversations. And she said, "Don't worry about us losing the house because there's something called Social Security." So long before I ever heard of Roosevelt, I was kind of a New Dealer in my bones
Right.
because
Right.
of the way my own family
Right.
was affected. And then the other thing I think that affected my politics, two other things. So we moved to Scarsdale, which was a rich
Hmm.
town, but we were about 10 feet inside the Scarsdale School District in a very modest 900 square foot house. And so I was a poor kid in a rich town. And that also influences your view of social class. And I remember one day in about seventh grade, a new friend was invited to my house for a play date, and his mother dropped us off, and he peered out the window and said, "Oh, this little bungalow?"
Hmm.
So, um, anyway, the combination of sort of what the New Deal did for my family and having a sense of social class, being a poor kid in a rich town. And then, of course, this is the 50s. And this is an era when America can do anything. And so I think there's a certain generational optimism that I've been imbued with. So that's a little bit about how my early life
Yeah.
influenced my politics and my temperament.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. You had this experiential evidence of the promise of America and the promise of an activist government in America and what
Very
it can
much
do for
so.
people.
Yep.
So that kind of informs your politics almost subconsciously. But I'm wondering, uh, at what point do you really turn to politics as a potential, vocation?
Yeah. Well, of course, the other thing that's going on in that period is the early civil rights movement. And then I went off to Oberlin College, which was a very progressive social, Christian social gospel kind of
Right.
progressivism. And
And that's like the late 50s or early
no, that's
60s?
the first half of the 60s.
Early 60s. Okay.
Yeah, and the first half of the 60s, before it all gets ruined, is a very hopeful time. Kennedy's president, Looks like the civil rights movement is going to gain some progress. We're having the beginning of détente with the Soviets. I mean, our commencement speaker was Martin Luther King.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
That's not in the book, I don't think.
I think it is, but
Oh,
anyway,
okay.
so
Wow.
yeah, so it's a and of course Oberlin is an unusual kind of college, so I get very much involved in politics at Oberlin, and then of course the war happens, and so you're swept if you're any kind of a liberal, you're swept up in the anti-war movement, and again, there's a big difference between the first half of the 60s and the second half of the 60s. First half of the 60s, there's a sense of hopefulness. Second half of the 60s, it all turns to shit. And so, again, my optimism, my sense of what America can be, it's imbued by my experiences in that era. And then I go off to a PhD program at Berkeley. But Berkeley at that point is consumed by radical politics, by the
Right.
anti-war
So you're
movement.
there on Berkeley in the 60s
Yeah,
and but you're there to you said sociology, uh
political
pol-
economy, really.
political economy. So
Yeah.
you were getting a master's degree there at the time.
Well, I was in a doctoral program, but by 1966, the world is falling apart. And I said to myself, I don't want to spend the next 4 years in graduate school. I want to
Right.
make some kind of a difference. I was impatient. I'm congenitally impatient. Uh,
I'm not
and
familiar with that at all.
no, no. But if you're writing 3 or 4 times a week, it helps to be impatient.
That's true.
Uh, yeah. So you're the same way, by the
I just
way.
want to comment on the before I forget to comment on Martin Luther King being your commencement speaker because I just want to make my own personal gripe about the fact that my commencement speaker the year before my graduating year was the sitting president George H.W. Bush at that time,
Wow.
or no, I'm sorry, he was former. The year after was the sitting first lady, Hillary Clinton. My year was Kathy Guyswhite, who created the Kathy comic strip.
Sorry.
So, when I hear good commencement speaking, I get angry. But
Well,
anyway,
let me just tell a story about that commencement. So the college, in order to kind of be even-handed, um, Martin Luther King is the commencement speaker, and they give an honorary degree to Dean Rusk. So
okay,
the student radicals, and I was in the student council, we said, oh, what the fuck do we do? Pardon
right.
me, the hell do we do? And so some people wanted to boycott the commit, our own graduation.
Hmm,
We
hmm.
said, no, let's do a very Oberlin kind of thing. Let's demand a meeting with Dean Rusk. So we demand a meeting with Dean Rusk. We get the meeting with Dean Rusk. I'm part of this group of students who go to the meeting, and
Hmm.
we pitch a peace plan. And we say, look, how about this? How about the great powers guarantee the neutrality and independence of Vietnam. It's led by the NLF, the Viet Cong, and then we call off the war. And Rusk just is scornful and ridiculous. What do you kids know? Well, it turns out us kids knew a lot more than he did because
Right,
the terms on which the war was eventually settled were even worse for the United States. So,
right. This
that
is
was,
very Bob Kuttner, ahead of his time, always looking for a possible solution.
there you go.
Uh, yeah. So I want to pick up the story at Berkeley because, like you say, you didn't want to end up doing a full on program there at a time that was very tumultuous. But there is something you did get into that came out, I think, of that experience,
Yeah.
and it's this thing called the International Student Union, I believe. So
National Student Association. Yeah.
there you go. Okay, so talk about that.
Well, this was how I accidentally almost became a spy. Mm.
Right.
So, National Student Association in those years was kind of a big deal. There were 300 or 400 campuses that were members. They had a convention every year called the National Student Congress. I was at NSA chapter at Oberlin. And so I noticed that they had an odd student deferment. You could go to work for the National Student Association and keep your student deferment. I said, okay, this is cool. I'm kind of
This is
sick of
during Vietnam, right? So the student
right in the
deferment
middle of
is an
Vietnam. Yeah.
important
Oh yeah.
thing.
No.
Right.
And draft deferment was, that was everything.
Right.
You want to do everything. A lot of people stayed in graduate school who didn't want to be in graduate school. This is before the lottery.
My
Lottery.
dad took an insane amount of sugar pills to try to make him look like he was
Well,
diabetic.
yeah, of course. So, keeping this is before the lottery for three
Right,
or
because
four years,
this is earlier than TED. This is like mid 60s is what
mid
we're
sixties.
talking. Yeah.
So I said, okay. So I was specializing in Latin American affairs. I spoke pretty good Spanish. So I applied for a job at the National Student Association running their Latin America program. And I got the job. And so there's another little story here, but I'll skip over that for the moment. So
Is this
I
the one about the guy coming, the friend coming to you and saying, don't be an
yeah,
officer?
no, that's part of the story. But there's
Okay.
the summer before I reported to work at the National Student Association, I had applied for an internship at the State Department. The State Department had a program with 50 colleges and universities, and they took one kid from each college, and you got to be an intern at the State Department. So what the hell, I'll apply for this. And I was very surprised that I got it because I had been very involved with anti-war politics. Bob Scheer, the radical journalist, was running for Congress as an anti-war campaign candidate. I was working as his press secretary, and somehow the security people who checked me out missed all that. They went to my old neighborhood in Scarsdale, and my mother told me they interviewed my neighbors on whether I was a loyal American, but somehow they missed the Scheer campaign. That made me kind of worried about my country that they could give somebody as subversive as me a security clearance. In any case, so I shave my beard, I buy a suit, I report for work at the State Department, and I'm given a little badge in the orientation session that says ARACCA, and that stands for American Republic's Area Coordinator of Cuban Affairs. And I'm assigned to the Cuba desk to be an assistant to the economics desk officer, and his job is to enforce the Cuba boycott, working with the CIA. So I literally spent the summer just absolutely appalled learning how this thing worked. I mean, the way it worked was we would get classified. Oh, and I had a top secret clearance. So we would get a notification from CIA saying,
By the way, just real quick, for those who are listening or watching, this Zelig-like explanation continues throughout Bob's life. So
yeah.
we're only at the part where he's has a rolling Cuba policy in the '60s, but it gets more insane. But go ahead.
So the way it worked was CIA would notify the Cuba desk at the State Department that an oil tanker is leaving the port of Coramshar, destined for Cuba, and you have to do whatever you can to screw that up. Send cables to the American embassy, this country, that country, and just make sure that oil tanker never goes. Or
Mm,
it's auto parts, and send a cable to the American embassy in
right.
Germany or Britain, France, make sure the auto parts never get there. I was just absolutely aghast. And so I leave that job saying, thank God I'm never going to be involved with the CIA again.
Did you do that, or were you engaging in any sort of civil disobedience around this, or were
No,
you
I was
dutiful?
just taking notes, thinking that, okay, someday I'm going to write this in a memoir.
Right.
Um,
There you
uh,
go.
it was like peering behind a curtain and seeing how stuff really worked.
Yeah.
Of course, what was interesting was this is 1966. So if you think about that, the Bay of Pigs was 61. The
Right.
Cuban Missile Crisis was 62. And
Right.
when Kennedy and Khrushchev drew the deal to sort of step away from World War III and call off the Cuban Missile Crisis. The deal is, okay, the United States is not going to try to overthrow Castro by military force. But in
Right.
fact, they continue trying to overthrow Castro by strangling the economy. And that
Yeah.
continues to this minute, right? We had this brief respite under
And
Obama.
covert operations, right? I mean,
Yeah,
they did that
yeah,
too.
absolutely. So the United States did not keep its part of the bargain
Right.
after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So anyway, so I said, okay, thank God I'm not going to be even indirectly involved with the CIA again. I go off to National Student Association, and
Right.
then because I had been at Berkeley, and Berkeley, for whatever reason, could only afford to send one of its three delegates to the NSA convention that summer. I said, well, look, I'm going to be going there anyway because I'm going to be joining the NSA staff. Maybe you'd like to credential me as a Berkeley delegate, which they did. And long story short, I end up running as the anti-war candidate for international affairs vice president. And then, as you alluded to, a friend took me aside and said, I can't tell you why, Bob, but you're going to find out soon enough. If you do this, it's going to ruin your life. And I took him very seriously. And Rick Stearns, who later became quite anti-war himself, now a federal judge, later worked for McGovern in 72. Rick was running as the more establishment candidate. And I said, look, we really need unity on this. If you will back the anti-war plank, I will stand down and support you. And so Rick, rather than I, got to be in the hot seat when it all blew up. And what all blew up was the fact that for almost 20 years, the international program of the National Student Association had been a CIA front. And the guy who'd been president the year before I went to work there broke the link with the CIA, but the deal was that they would never reveal the history. And then Ramparts magazine, which was the sort of Mother Jones of its day, got
Hmm.
hold of the story, and that
Run
was
by Robert Scheer, right? I mean, to
Bob was one of
close the
the
loop here. Yeah.
yeah Bob was one of the editors of Ramparts. Warren Hinkle was the sort of the
Yeah.
master. But in any case, so and I had so I said, okay, I'm running a Latin America program, and what do I do? Well, I organize student exchanges. So in the fall of '66. I take a trip to Peru and Bolivia and make friends with various student leaders and arrange for them to come to the United States, and it all goes very swimmingly. And then in December, the staff is called in by the two officers and told, we have kind of bad news. You didn't know it, but NSA has been a CIA front since 1950. And even worse news, it's all going to blow. Uh,
Right.
Parts has the story. And so um, the staff and the board, which was headed by Sam Brown, later architect of the Dump Johnson movement, um, was unanimous in saying the deal that was struck a year ago is not good enough. We have to confirm everything. We have to confirm everything. And so one of the stories I tell in the memoir is that just before it blew, Rick Stearns and I were sharing a house. Rick came down for breakfast, white as a sheet, and the number two guy at the CIA had called him at 4 o'clock in the morning
Hmm.
and said, if you confirm this, we will make sure you get sent to Vietnam and get killed. And so, if you've ever seen the movie 3 Days of the Condor, it's like, how deep does this,
Yeah.
who's on which side? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? What are they going to do to us? And we were just scared silly. So, I
Mm.
left, and it kind of as penance, I went to work for I.F. Stone. Uh,
Well, wait. I mean, I want to figure out this connection because, in your collegiate career, you were looking at politics, political economy, but it was academic. I want to understand the move and the motivation for the move into journalism.
Oh,
So why did you drift in that direction?
well, I had always been partly involved in journalism. There was a magazine at Oberlin called The Activist that I was
Hmm.
involved in. Um, and
Was that the sanctioned student newspaper, or was it just some off, like
No,
thing you were doing on
it
your
was
own?
it was a magazine.
Okay,
It was officially recognized, but it wasn't the official student newspaper.
I see.
And it had always been a kind of an avocation. And I guess when I decided that I didn't want to get a doctorate and be a college professor, it was a kind of it was a logical move for me. And I.F. Stone, of course, was the great, he was the first blogger. He was the great
Yeah.
independent journalist of his generation, and going to work for him seemed like a dream job. It turned out that he went through three or four assistants a year because once you got over the thrill of working for I.F. Stone, the actual job was sitting in his basement with piles of congressional records and hearing records
Maybe
because,
maybe we should explain what I.F. Stone would do, or what his sort of specialty
well,
was. He would go through these transcripts and pick out nuggets that were hiding in plain sight,
yeah,
essentially, right?
well, actually, his assistant would do that.
Yeah, you would do that, and then
Yeah,
he would write about it.
yeah, but he was very hard of hearing, and so as a consequence, he would turn to the public record, and he was amazing. I mean, he was a great independent leftist. He was pretty far left, but he had no sympathy whatsoever for the Soviet Union. He had worked as Washington correspondent for a radical daily called PM, which published for about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years in the 40s. And then when he was in his close to 50 years old, I guess he was in mid 40s, with three kids, he started this weekly. And it became kind of anybody who was any kind of a progressive in that era subscribed to I.F. Stone's Weekly. So in principle, working for him was a total thrill. After about a week sitting in his basement for 8 hours a day, going through hearing records, it wasn't such a thrill. And so I lasted a few. I mean, Pete Osnos had worked there. Carl Bernstein had worked there. He just
Wow.
went through lots of people. And so I said to him, I love working with you, but I don't want to do this forever. And he was very familiar with this problem, so he introduced me to a friend of his who was the most leftish member of Congress in that era, named William Fitzryan, and I went to work for Ryan. It was only after that that I became involved in journalism.
Mm. So yeah, there was this, and we can talk about this in a little bit about the move between journalism and politics, at least at the staff level. But um, so you get, you quickly tire of the I.F. Stone thing, and then you're kind of bouncing around journalism, doing a lot of interesting work. I want to fast forward a little bit, and you can fill in the blanks between these two things. But I want to fast forward a little to when the Washington Post decides what they decide, because that's an incredible story. So just take us to that moment and then through it.
Yeah. So I'm 29 years old. My wife is pregnant with our first child. Um, and
And you had been doing, like freelance stuff and
well,
and
I had
working
been,
in.
yeah, I had
Go
been
ahead.
working. My bread and butter was I was working for Pacifica Radio, which was the radical radio network that predates NPR, listener-sponsored radio they invented.
Oh, right.
And
I forgot about that part. You had a role to play in the George Carlin Seven Dirty Words. Yeah, yeah. Tell that story.
well, just let me set the stage for
Yeah,
a minute.
please.
So, um, so I'm dividing my time between being Washington editor of the Village Voice and being involved in Pacifica Radio, and I'm starting to freelance for national magazines. I had one piece in the Times Magazine and one about to come out in Harper's. Now, the George Carlin bit. Um, so our noontime talk guy at WBAI in New York, a guy named Paul Gorman, just as a spontaneous provocation, decides to play the George Carlin bit, the 7 words you're not allowed to say on television. He does
Right.
he does it at noon. It happens there's a guy who's involved in a group called Morality in Media who's driving with his 15-year-old son and hears this. It almost drives off the road and files a complaint with the FCC, which goes all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right.
And we are told by our lawyers to lie. We're told by our lawyers to lie, that this was not Gorman's spontaneous provocation. This was very carefully considered by management. And because of the redeeming social value in Carlin's commentary, we decide to play this. Uh, this drags on for 5 years, I think. And in the final case, I think it was 5-4, it might have been 6-3, it's found that this was indecent but not obscene. And
Mhm.
Pacifica doesn't lose its license. And that's the Pacifica case. And that's the definition. That's where they define the
It's a really important free speech case,
yeah,
and you happen to
yeah.
be sitting there as the as
Well,
running the
I was
station.
at that point, I was no longer the general
Oh,
manager,
you
but
weren't. Okay.
I was peripherally involved in it. I mean, we were
Right.
all
Okay.
involved. I had
Right.
hired Gorman, so I was,
Okay.
feeling responsible.
There you
Okay.
go.
So I'm 29. My wife is pregnant. I'm working for the Village Voice. I've had one and a half um, national magazine pieces, one of which was actually pretty good. It was in the Times Magazine. It was on Nixon's efforts to politicize the IRS. And the Harper's piece was on money in politics, on campaign finance. So at that point, um, Watergate has happened. It's 1973. And
Right.
these two kids, Woodward and Bernstein, on the Metro desk are running rings around the national desk, which is just not breaking any of the story
At the Washington Post, to be
at the
clear.
Post.
Yeah.
And Dick Harwood, who's the national editor, is feeling totally humiliated and wants his own answer to Woodward and Bernstein and hires me. And and this is the mother of all setups for failure, right?
Right.
Bob and Carl had been on this for a year at that point, over a year. They owned the story. There was no way I was going to do anything other than interesting peripheral stuff like Nixon's efforts to politicize the IRS. But in terms of, the basic Watergate story, please. And I was embarrassed because they should have created one more slot on the national staff, and they should have moved Woodward and Bernstein to the national staff or something. So
Right. Did you ever interact with them while they were doing this? Like, did they see you as some interloper? Like, how did that go?
I think it was so clear that they owned the story that they weren't the least bit threatened.
Mm.
So I'm there doing some stuff, doing some not bad stuff, and then disaster strikes in that Harwood, who had brought me in, the Grahams decide that they want to acquire some other properties. They buy the Trenton Times, and they send Harwood off to run it. And then Harry, who's Woodward and Bernstein's Metro editor, gets promoted to national editor. So at
Right.
that point, I am toast. And it's only a question of whether I'm going to be transferred to covering the Montgomery County School Board. Uh, I'm going to be fired, or so I start
Right.
looking for a job, and I get very lucky in that Bill Proxmire Center from Wisconsin had just
Right.
become.
I don't. I want to get there, but
Yeah,
just to close, because I mean, think of the people already that we've talked about on this session. But there's even more because when you go to the Post, you're put in one of these desks that has sort of four spokes to it, and there are four Carols on the desk. And who are the three other people?
yeah, they're Mort Mintz, who is just the greatest um, economic investigative, or corporate investigative reporter of his generation, scourge of the drug industry. Bill Grider, again, just total hero, and Jack McKenzie, who covered the Supreme Court.
Right.
And so the day I report for work,
Yeah.
Mort says, Bob, can you help me out with something? I said, "Well, yes, sir." I mean, Mort at that point, I'm 30, he's 53, he's a complete hero. And I said, sure, whatever you want. He said, well, there's this thing called the renegotiation board. I said, yeah. He said it was set up during World War II when they had cost plus defense contracts, and it was a post audit. So if the defense contract made more money than it was supposed to, they would claw back the money, and it
Right.
saved hundreds of billions of dollars. And they've been trying to kill it. Nixon's close to killing it, but it somehow survived from the 40s into the 70s. I said, yeah. And he said, well, I have several sources on the renegotiation board. I got a big story coming out in the paper tomorrow morning, and I want to protect my sources. I said, yeah. So he said, so I got hold of a phone book of everybody who works at the renegotiation board, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide up the phone book. You're going to call half of them. I'm going to call half of them. You're going to say, hi, this is Bob Kuttner from the Washington Post. I'm doing a story on the renegotiation board. Will you talk to me? No, slam. And by the time we finish, when my story runs, and tomorrow morning, when they call everybody in and they say, who's the son of a bitch who talked to the Post? There's a record that every single person on the renegotiation board was on the phone with the Post.
Right.
So,
I'm
so
just imagining the comic, farcical version of All the President's Men. So, one of the great scenes in All the President's Men is Robert Redford as Bob Woodward calling all these people saying, "Hi, I'm Bob Woodward from the Washington Post.
yeah.
Will you talk to me?" Essentially, and I'm imagining it as you instead of Redford, and everyone's hanging up on you, and you're in the middle of this weird power play. But that was what a great gambit
Well,
by
but
Mintz.
I was just in awe of what a great reporter Mintz was, and I kind of tell this story to young journalists about, the importance of protecting your sources.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. So fantastic. So yes, then there's this interlude, as you say, just as you see the walls caving in at the Washington Post, a door opens in Congress. So and what did you end up doing there?
well, that's where I really learned political economy, right? Because he was chair of the banking committee,
It was
and he
William
hired,
Proxmire. I
yeah,
think I cut you off. So William
no, yeah,
Proxmire is from
yeah, and
Wisconsin.
I was hired as his chief investigator, and I spent 3 years really learning about how financial capitalism works and ran some, great investigations on foreign corporate bribery that resulted in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, um, and a lot of stuff on redlining and corruption at the FHA. And it was better than graduate school, right? Because it was a real time graduate education in how financial capitalism worked. And that's really how I
Right.
learned how to be uh, a journalist specializing in political economy. That was
Mm,
as foundational for who I became as as anything else.
right.
And so when I segue back to journalism after that, and this is now the mid 70s or late 70s,
Yeah.
I write my first book on Prop 13 and the California tax revolt. And so, by the time I really pursue a more regular career in journalism, I'm kind of grounded as a specialist in political economy.
Yeah. There's two things that strike me about that period. So you were, we have a special issue coming out pretty soon, by the way, on people throughout history who challenge power. And the one that you wrote about was Ferdinand Pecora. And what you
Right.
say is you had his job. So Ferdinand Pecora was the guy who did the banking investigations in the Senate Banking Committee in the 1930s after the Wall Street crash. And he uncovered basically the rot at the heart of the banking system, and it led to the all sorts of investigations, all sorts of legislation, Securities Exchange Act and 1940 Act and a whole host, Glass-Steagall and more. You get there and you're still in an era, and this might be confusing to people who watch Congress today, but this still was an era where you could actually get legislation done based on your investigations, so that oversight and policy were actually linked in a way that they're not now. So yeah, talk about that.
Well, just with one big difference. Pecora was the rare staff guy who was so incredibly good that Peter Norbeck, the committee chair,
Yeah.
let him run the investigation. That by the 70s, that was no longer the case. I mean, Prox, I fed him stuff, I prepped him, I did the background work, but
Right.
Prox, ran
He
the
asked
game.
the questions.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I mean, but what you did is, setting these things up, and we've talked about this about oversight and how you set them up
yeah.
almost like a play,
Oh, yeah,
where you are putting together a presentation for the media, for the benefit of the other members of the committee,
that's
and making the case that there's a problem here that needs a solution, which I think is really an interesting way to conceive of it, and also relates to journalism. It's you're telling a story.
that's spot on, David. I mean, also there's narrative to it. I mean, there's heroes and villains. I
Yeah,
mean, we would orchestrate these hearings. We'd have good guys and bad guys. We'd have the anti-redlining activists, and then we'd have the bankers in the
yeah,
role of heavy. So it's a lot
yeah.
of that's the other
Yeah.
thing.
So,
There's an
and it
incredible
led
amount of
to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as you said. It also led to the Community Reinvestment
right,
Act,
right,
the Mortgage Disclosure Act. Was that in
right.
that time
Yeah,
too?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, like this great legislation of the 70s that was sort of, I think you've described it as non-reformist reform, like the stuff that gives, in this case, uh, in terms of the Community Reinvestment Act, gives communities on the ground a fighting chance to get at least some version of the capital infusion that these
Right.
communities need.
We called it regulation as an organizing tool.
Right.
It's regulation not in a way that empowers bureaucrats, but that empowers regular people to go after the bad guys. So, that was a lot of fun, and we actually accomplished some stuff. And so, at that point, I'm in my mid to late 30s, and so when I finally land on my feet as a journalist, unlike at the Post, where I was, promoted to my level of incompetence too too early in my career, this time I've sort of filled in some blanks. I'm grounded, and so I end up with a bunch of gigs. I'm writing books. I'm economics editor of the Republic. I'm doing a
New
column
Republic. Yeah.
for Business, column for
Yeah.
Business Week, and all of that is the lead up to probably the most important thing I've done in my life, which is to co-found the Prospect, because
Yeah.
we can get to that in a minute, but
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
no, let's go there because you have a decade where, in the book on Prop 13, Life of the Party, uh, is really foundational in terms of understanding the changes in American society around that time that leads to the Reagan Revolution, et cetera. Um,
and,
and yeah, go ahead.
well, as the later chapters of the book explain, and this is where I sort of pivot from personal stuff to more political analysis, it isn't just the Reagan Revolution, it's three Democratic presidents as
Yeah,
enablers of neoliberalism. It's Carter, and then worst of all, Clinton, and then Obama, bungling a Roosevelt moment by hiring the Clinton people who had brought us deregulation, which in turn brought us the 2008 collapse. And, that's how you and I got to know each other, David, because we both wrote
yeah,
about the consequences of the 2008 collapse. But by by 1989, when we founded the Prospect, the conventional wisdom was, well, the Democrats need to learn from the Republicans. The Democrats need to embrace markets. The Democrats need to move to the political center. And Reich and Starr and I, when we founded the magazine, said, no, this is crazy. we need to be more persuasive New Dealers. We need to bring the New Deal up to date for a different era because ordinary people are getting screwed now in the same way that they were getting screwed in the 30s. And we need a magazine that makes that case, that tells that story. And that's why, I mean, founding a magazine, Christ, is a risky venture. It's been perils of Pauline for almost 40 years, but
Right.
we felt we really needed to do it.
Yeah, that's a great summation of, and it shows not only sort of what you've lived through, and sort of kind of gets back to the core theme of the book, which is, we were right about many of the economic things that are going forward, but we couldn't nail the politics. I mean, we can talk about the prospect itself if you'd like for a minute here, and then I want to come back to where we
Sure.
just left off. But as you say, it was designed to fill a space, and a space politically, a voice that was maybe not being served at that moment. And can you talk about those origins of
Sure.
why you set the prospect where you set it, and how that succeeded?
Well, I think, a magazine is more than just a publication. It's a community of thinkers. It's a community of readers and writers. And I think no sooner did we launch the magazine than we started attracting very serious writers who agreed with us that this was not just a niche, but a huge area for discourse that nobody else was quite taking on. So, I mean, the first couple of issues, um, uh, Christopher Jenks and his graduate student Kathy Eden write this piece on the real welfare problem, in which they
Hmm.
pointed out that, hey, in fact, welfare recipients do cheat, and cheating is endemic. But the reason cheating is endemic is that AFDC doesn't pay people enough to live on. So it's
Right.
taking a kind of familiar contention and taking it in a whole other direction. Deborah Stone wrote a piece called AIDS in the Moral Economy of Insurance, pointing out that the whole logic of the private health insurance industry is to discriminate against people who might get sick. And that's why insurance companies discriminate against gays. These pieces are almost 40 years old, but they could be written,
Yeah.
yesterday because they're still all too topical. And we had one piece after another like that. And so the magazine got noticed fairly quickly because we were filling a void.
Right. And so much so that when there is a Democratic president that comes back in the form of Bill Clinton, two of the three co-founders actually go into the Clinton White House. And you could you talk like, did you have an opportunity to join them there, and then maybe the magazine is over, or did you
No,
consciously stay outside and want to put pressure on this president?
yes, yes, and yes. And I did not have as sanguine a view of Clinton as Bob and Paul did. I mean, Paul thought that Clinton would be the vehicle for achieving a rather complicated second best version of national health insurance, and Clinton didn't do that. Reich, as he's explained in his own two memoirs,
Yeah.
uh, uh, Reich was the outlier in the cabinet. I mean, because Reich had been at Oxford with Clinton and, knew Clinton very, very well. When the more conservative people around Clinton tried to restrain Reich, Reich would tell them to go to hell. And Reich did a kind of a inside-outside game with Ted Kennedy, where they tried to push Clinton to the left, not with much success, and Reich packs it in after one term.
Yeah.
So, and Paul goes back to Princeton. Paul goes back to the Prospect. So I was sort of holding the fort by myself for a couple of years. Um, but it was accidentally because two of the three of us had big jobs in the Clinton administration. It helped us raise a lot of money because people thought that, hey, this is a magazine that's very important to President
Right.
Clinton.
These
So
guys are
we'll
insiders,
sort of,
but
yeah, right.
what it turned out is they were doing what the prospect does, which is
Pushing,
trying to
yeah,
push to the what you call the left edge of the possible.
yeah,
So, okay, and I mean we could go through a bunch of stuff I don't think people need to. They can look at the sort of rise and fall from the standpoint of it becoming a magazine that's out every 2 weeks and hatching the early blogosphere, one of the first magazines to really have. I mean, my introduction to the prospect is through Tapped, which was the group blog that a lot of the young bloggers
yeah.
were working on, and all of that. And I mean, that's obviously important foundational stuff. But I'm curious about. I want to wrap this up shortly, but the book is called Notes for Next Time. And if you look at the past year in politics, you get a sense that there is potentially, went from a time of real despair over the future of democracy to this potential that there could be a next time. And all of the energy for that next time is happening on the left. Some would say the far left, where the left edge of the possible seems to be moving out to a different place than it was maybe even 1 year ago. We're seeing these Democratic Socialists win, beat incumbent Congress members. We're seeing the rise of Zoran Mamdani and a kind of a social democracy model in New York City that people can point to and say this isn't theoretical, like this can actually work. And I'm curious, having written this book at a time that was probably more of a time of the despair part of this term of Donald Trump, and seeing this shift, which I know you've written about. Um, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how the experiences that you went through can inform this moment today.
So, yeah, that's exactly the right note to end on. And thank you. So, the last chapter is very hopeful in one respect and a little bit more sober in another respect. The hopeful part is I argue that I think democracy is going to hold. I think there's a decent chance we'll elect a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, even a progressive Congress in 2028. And I go through why I think that's the case. And I was very lucky to find a publisher who broke the rules on publishing and gave me instead of having to wait 9 months for the book to come out, he figured out how to do it with a 2 week lead time.
Hmm.
So I was right up until March when this was published, I was continuing to revise right up until pub date. And so some of the shift, Mamdani and some of the wins in all the off-year elections, that's in the last chapter of the book. But the
Hmm.
part that's not so hopeful, or at least not so sanguine, if you look at what my generation had, and this is where I use my own life story to recap, the social contract that my generation had, you get to
Yeah.
buy a house without having rich parents. You get to college, you get to go to college without debt.
Yeah.
You get to have a career that's not a gig. You get real pensions. That's gone. That's been blown to hell. And to get anything like that, and that's, by the way, why we got Trump, that the life chances of regular people were completely obliterated, and Democrats were almost as complicit in this as Republicans, especially to the extent that Democrats embraced neoliberalism. So, to get anything like that back, and to get back the credibility that Democrats had in the era of the long New Deal's legacy, you're going to have a president who's as radical as Roosevelt, maybe even
Yeah.
more so. Because if you
Yeah.
go through what it would take to get each element of that back, wow, that's
Yeah.
DSA might have some ideas on that, but you really do have to look to the left edge of the possible to write that kind of manifesto. And a lot of the 2029 manifestos, they're not nearly radical enough. They would not be transformative. People would not
Yeah.
see their life chances changing. And that's part of why Biden couldn't get reelected. One big part was Biden himself. But the other part, even as good as the program was, it was only a down payment. People would look back at the Biden program and look at their own life and say, my life hasn't changed. So,
Yeah.
in order
Yeah.
not to get the next Trump, and that's the notes for next time part, in order not to get the next Trump, we're going to have a president who's as radical as Roosevelt.
Let me say a couple things here before we close. Number one, if you think about when was the last time when these life circumstances were so difficult, it's you're probably talking about the time before the first progressive era, and there's a lot of attempts to associate this is the second Gilded Age. I think in some ways, from an inequality standpoint, it's worse. So you have to think about, what did the people at that time, and not just, sort of the early Wilson reforms, but also, what was done after 1933. It took a major crisis, a social crisis to get us to that point. So I hope that doesn't happen again.
Well, one last comment. If you look back on American history, there are situations, but there are also flukes. It was a total fluke that Teddy Roosevelt ended up being in the White House for almost 8 years. That's what it took to get this inchoate set of progressive impulses actually enacted into law.
Yeah.
It was a fluke that Roosevelt didn't get assassinated. The bullet very narrowly missed him, killed the mayor of Chicago instead.
Franklin Roosevelt, to be clear.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Teddy was
And
shot at too, and then he continued and
right,
finished the speech. This was during the
right,
1912
right.
election. But anyway,
And there are good flukes and bad flukes. I mean, Kennedy's assassination, King's assassination, and there are moments of upsurge that you would not have predicted, like the civil rights movement taking off in 59 and 60,
yeah.
like Mamdani taking off. So the great thing about politics is it's not just iron laws, it's partly flukes, good flukes, bad flukes. And when you get a good one, you got to ride that wave.
Well, and then I would say one more thing, one last thing, which is when those moments of opportunity arise, you have to have people in place that are really thinking about the kind of change that's commensurate with the moment. In other words, you need a posture of actually knowing what happens inside the government, why things are the way that they are, and knowing what structures need to be changed, altered in order to get us to that better place.
Yeah.
And, I think that is something I take away from your work, whether it was inside the halls of power or outside banging down those walls. It's rooted in the reality of this is why things have gone awry, and these are the steps that we can take to fix that. And so, I don't want to flatter you too much by saying we need more Bob Kuttners out there, but we do. I mean, one thing I am a little bit concerned about with this new crop of leftists coming into the government is what is their program, right? I mean, what do they know enough about the structures inside government to actually fix it? Do they know about the impediments to change that are all around us, at whether it's at the Supreme Court level or at the level of how Congress is structured or at the level of the executive power grab that continues apace? How are they going to figure that part of it out so that they can realize their agenda? And I think that we need more people who have that experience, who have that understanding. And it's really, as you say, it's like look at the reality, look at what happened, and think about that when we're in this moment where we have to have this big change again.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Old guys are always worried that young guys don't know enough. And I think young guys are better at social movements. The
Yeah,
civil rights movement, the anti-war movement were led by the young, maybe than they are at governing. On the other hand, you look at the 30s, they figured out how to govern.
yeah.
And I think that's what we need going forward.
Absolutely. Well, this was a fascinating
It
discussion.
was. Thank you.
Bob, thank you so much. The book is called Notes for Next Time. It's an incredible life story, but also it has really important lessons for the present. So thank you. This has been a conversation here on our Prospect YouTube page. You can come here, sign up as anytime we have these little videos. You'll get a notification. You can check it out. But thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.